The hospital halls were quieter than usual. Outside, winter had wrapped the small town in an icy stillness. Snow piled up along the sidewalks, and each breath in the cold night air came out like smoke. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while Dr. Clara Bennett, a young resident on her third consecutive night shift, leaned against the reception desk, exhaustion tugging at every muscle in her body. It was the kind of night that made everything feel slower. Time, footsteps, even thoughts. Clara sipped lukewarm coffee from a paper cup when the sliding doors to the ER hissed open unexpectedly. A gust of frigid air rushed in, scattering loose papers and breaking the sterile silence. She looked up. There, standing just beyond the threshold, was a dog. His name was Ranger. Not the kind you'd expect to find in a warm home, but a large, scruffy creature caked with dirt and dried leaves. His fur was matted and wet from snow. Ranger didn't bark or growl. He just stood there, panting, shivering, and in his mouth, clenched tightly, was something that stopped Clara cold. A baby's diaper. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the entire ER staff froze, exchanging confused glances. But the dog's eyes didn't leave Clara's. There was no fear in his gaze, only urgency. A quiet, desperate plea. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the sterile hum of the ER now a distant noise behind her. Her eyes locked with the dog's. There was no barking, no growl, just that unshakable urgency in his stare. Something inside her stirred, a sense of knowing, of being called. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat from the back of the chair, pushed through the swinging doors, and stepped into the night. Clara stepped through the automatic doors, the blast of cold air cutting through her hospital scrubs like ice. Ranger backed up a few paces, his paws sinking into the slush-covered pavement, then turned his head sharply, as if urging her to follow. She hesitated for only a second, then moved after him. "Dr. Bennett?" a nurse called from behind her, confused. But Clara didn't look back. Something in her gut, something primal and unexplainable, told her this wasn't just a stray wandering aimlessly. Ranger wasn't just seeking shelter. He was leading her somewhere. His gait was uneven, quick but cautious. Every few feet, he stopped and looked over his shoulder to make sure she was still there. His breath came out in steaming puffs, and his wet fur clung to his ribs. Yet he moved with determination, almost urgency. They passed through the hospital's side lot and out onto a quiet back street, lined with dim streetlights and empty cars half buried in snow. The only sound was the crunch of Clara's boots and the soft padding of Ranger's paws. Her heart pounded louder than both. "Where are you taking me?" she thought, tightening her coat against the bitter wind. Ranger darted down a narrow alley, his form disappearing into the shadows before reappearing under a flickering security light. He paused there, waiting. Clara caught up, her breath shallow, her fingers numb. "What is this?" she whispered. Ranger's ears twitched. He let out a low, urgent whine and turned again, faster this time. Something was out there, something that mattered, and Clara no longer questioned whether she should follow. She had to. The alley gave way to a narrow footpath behind an old row of abandoned shops. Snow lay thick across the ground, untouched save for Ranger's fresh tracks. Clara pushed forward, her breaths shallow and sharp in the freezing air. Ranger suddenly stopped near a rusted dumpster and turned his head toward a shadowy corner beneath the crumbling brick wall. He let out a low bark, not loud, but urgent, filled with purpose. Clara followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing. Then, something moved. She rushed closer and dropped to her knees. There, nestled against the wall, was a tiny bundle. A child. A newborn wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, barely larger than Clara's forearms. The baby's face was pale, lips tinged blue, tiny chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. "Oh my God," Claire gasped, her voice breaking. "No, no, no, please." She threw off her coat and wrapped it tightly around the baby's fragile body, cradling him to her chest, trying to warm him with her own trembling hands. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't care. The baby whimpered weakly, still alive. "Hold on," she whispered, standing carefully, the child pressed against her. "Stay with me." Ranger paced nearby, circling protectively, his eyes never leaving them. He barked again, sharper this time, as if urging her to hurry. Clara turned and ran. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she raced back through the alley, past dim lights and frozen cars, her breath tearing from her lungs. Ranger kept pace beside her, glancing up at her between strides, guiding her back toward the hospital doors. Inside the ER, chaos erupted the moment Clara burst through. "Infant hypothermia, get a warmer ready, now!" she shouted. The medical team sprang into motion, but as Clara handed the baby off and watched the nurses rush him down the corridor, her eyes searched for Ranger. He stood just outside the entrance, chest heaving, eyes locked on her. And in that moment, she knew he had saved that child's life. The ER had returned to its usual rhythm, but something was different. The staff moved quickly, efficiently, but with a kind of reverence, like they all sensed the gravity of what had just happened. The newborn boy, now stable, lay inside a heated incubator. Nurses monitored his vitals while doctors murmured in hushed tones. No one asked where he had come from. No one needed to. Not yet. Clara stood at the glass window outside the NICU, arms folded tightly around herself, her hospital coat still damp from melted snow. Her gaze drifted, not to the child, but to the entrance, where Ranger sat quietly, watching. He hadn't tried to come inside again. He simply remained in place, tail wrapped around his legs, his posture still, almost solemn. There was no aggression in him, no panic, only patience, and something else Clara couldn't name: loyalty. Clara stepped outside, her shoes crunching against the thin layer of ice near the doorway. Ranger looked up at her but didn't move. His eyes were dark, steady, knowing. "You stayed?" she whispered, crouching to meet him at eye level. She reached out a hand slowly. Ranger didn't flinch. He leaned forward and pressed his nose against her palm, the contact warm and startlingly gentle. "You're not just a stray, are you?" she said, quietly. He blinked once, as if in answer. Something about him felt ancient, like he carried stories no one else could tell. Clara looked back toward the NICU. Somehow, this dog had known exactly what to do, where to go, and who to find, and now he was here, as if to make sure the child was safe until the very end. Ranger wasn't just a messenger, he was a guardian. The following morning brought a heavy gray sky and a biting wind that swept through the hospital parking lot. Clara hadn't slept. She couldn't. The infant remained stable in the NICU, his tiny body warming under the gentle hum of machines. But while the baby was safe for now, questions lingered like a low fog. Questions Clara couldn't ignore. Who had left him out there? And why? Ranger was still there. He hadn't left the hospital grounds. Nurses left bowls of water and scraps of food for him near the back entrance, and he never strayed far. Clara approached slowly, crouching beside him. Ranger lifted his head, eyes weary, but still holding that silent wisdom. She sat there for a moment, unsure what to say. Then the words slipped out, softer than a whisper. "You brought him here?" Her voice caught. "I need to find her," she said, not even knowing why she was speaking aloud. "His mother. You know where she is, don't you?" Ranger stared at her, still and quiet. Then, without a sound, he stood. Clara's heart skipped. He took a few steps forward, stopped, and looked back at her. She followed. Through slushy alleys and quiet back streets, past shuttered storefronts and snow-covered bus stops. The world was gray and frozen, but the space between them felt alive with unspoken urgency. Clara didn't ask where they were going. Somehow she knew Ranger would show her. Not with logic, but with trust. They walked in silence for what felt like miles, her breath growing shallow, her legs aching. But she didn't stop. Not when Ranger's pace quickened, not when the buildings grew more broken, and not when they finally reached a narrow alley behind an abandoned warehouse. There, beneath a stairwell tucked in shadow, Ranger slowed. He looked back at Clara and let out a soft, almost mournful sound. She stepped forward, and the truth began to take shape in the dark. The alley was still. Only the crunch of Clara's boots broke the silence as she approached the narrow stairwell where Ranger had stopped. At first, she didn't see anything. Then, movement, a slow shift in the shadows. There, beneath the crumbling steps, curled into herself like a wounded bird, was a woman. Her clothes hung in layers of fabric and threadbare blankets, her face pale from cold and exhaustion. She looked up, startled, eyes hollow with fear. Ranger moved first. He padded toward her and lay down a few feet away, tail brushing the ground in slow, steady beats. The woman relaxed slightly at the sight of him. Her hand, gloved in mismatched wool, reached out shakily, brushing his fur like greeting an old friend. Clara approached gently, her voice soft. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. "My name is Clara. I'm a doctor." The woman didn't respond. Clara took a breath, then spoke the words that mattered. "We have your baby. He's safe. Alive." The woman froze. Her eyes widened, stunned, disbelieving. "Noah," she breathed, barely a whisper. Is it Noah?" Clara nodded. Tears rushed into the woman's eyes. "He's alive?" she asked again, her voice cracking as her lips trembled. She lifted a shaking hand to her mouth, her whole body beginning to tremble. Sobs rippled through her thin frame as she hunched forward, crumbling beneath the weight of emotion. Her hand pressed tightly to her face. Then her voice broke through the tears. "I no longer have the strength to care for him. Everything around me is falling apart." She paused, voice lowering to almost nothing. "I left him there, in the cold. I told myself it was the only way, that maybe someone better would find him. But every minute since, I've hated myself for it." Her eyes filled with shame as she looked down. What kind of mother walks away from her own baby? "I thought I was doing what was best, but I still hear him crying, even when he's not there." Clara knelt beside her, eyes soft with compassion. Maria looked at the dog curled beside her, tears still streaming down her face. With Clara's arm around her shoulders and Ranger walking beside them, Maria stood up. And together, they began their slow, quiet return to the hospital. The fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby flickered softly as Clara guided Maria through the main entrance. The warmth inside wrapped around them like a quiet welcome after the bitter cold of the streets. Maria walked slowly, almost mechanically, as if each step were heavier than the last. Ranger stayed close at her heel, his head low, his body calm but alert, still watching over her. They took the elevator in silence. When the doors opened to the NICU floor, Maria hesitated. Her breath caught. Her eyes darted around, afraid to hope, afraid to face what waited. Clara gently placed a hand on her arm. "He's just around the corner," she said softly. "You're not alone." Maria nodded once, her throat too tight to speak. As they entered the neonatal unit, a nurse glanced up and gave Clara a small nod of understanding. She opened the door to a quiet room, filled with the soft hum of monitors and the steady beeping of a heart monitor. There, inside the incubator, lay a tiny baby, his skin pink now, his chest rising and falling in slow, rhythmic breaths. Peaceful. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her knees gave out and she dropped to the floor, sobbing. "Noah," she whispered, her voice breaking open. "My sweet baby boy." She leaned forward, trembling, her forehead nearly touching the glass. "Forgive me, Noah. I tried to be strong, but I broke. I never stopped loving you." Clara knelt beside her, her own eyes wet. "You found your way back to him," she said gently. "That's what matters now." Maria pressed her hand to the glass, her fingers shaking, her soul pouring into the silence. And there he was, still here, still breathing. Ranger stood quietly in the doorway, his gaze steady, calm, and watchful. He didn't move, but his presence filled the room like a quiet force. Maria turned toward him, tears still streaking her cheeks, but now mixed with something else, gratitude. "Thank you, Ranger," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You saved my son. You saved my family." Around them, doctors and nurses stood silently, moved by the sacredness of the moment. They no longer saw just a dog, but a guardian, a quiet hero who had completed his mission not with words, but with loyalty and love. Maria was allowed to remain beside Noah as the medical team continued monitoring his progress. Hours passed. Slowly, the baby began to respond. His fingers twitched, his eyes fluttered when he heard his mother's voice. Maria held his tiny hand in hers, her eyes full of love and hope. Ranger lay by the door, tired but alert. Maria looked at him, her voice low but steady. "You gave me back my son, Ranger, and I'll never forget that." In the days that followed, the hospital transformed into something more than just a place of medicine. It became a shelter for healing, for quiet redemption, for second chances. Clara spent every spare moment checking in on Maria and Noah. The baby continued to grow stronger with each passing day, responding to the warmth of his mother's voice, to her gentle touch. The bond between them, though broken by circumstance, was stitching itself back together, thread by thread. Maria, once silent and withdrawn, began to open up. Her eyes, once clouded with guilt, now held something else, the flicker of hope. Clara reached out to a nearby women's shelter, one known not just for providing food and a bed, but for offering real support, childcare, counseling, and a chance to rebuild. The shelter director, a warm-hearted woman named Denise, welcomed Maria and Noah with open arms. Ranger went with them. No one questioned it. At the shelter, Ranger quickly became more than a companion. He was a presence of comfort. He lay beside Noah's crib as if keeping watch, followed Maria around the halls like a silent shadow. The other women noticed him too. They began leaving out scraps of food, offering quiet pats on his head. Somehow, everyone seemed to understand. He wasn't just a dog. He was part of the story now. Word of what had happened spread quietly throughout the hospital and the community. People came forward to offer baby supplies, blankets, clothes, even a stroller. One nurse donated a handmade quilt. Another brought fresh groceries to the shelter door. Maria, overwhelmed by the kindness, wept more than once. But now, her tears were different. They weren't from guilt or fear. They were from something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Oak Ridge, Montana had always been the kind of place where winter arrived like a quiet guest, early, steady, and uninvited. But tonight was different. The air felt too sharp, the silence too deep. Local radio had been warning about the incoming blizzard for days, calling it the worst storm in over half a century. Inside a small, aging house on the edge of town, the Miller family was doing their best to ignore the warnings. David, a 35-year-old electrician recently laid off, sat cross-legged on the living room floor, tinkering with a broken space heater. Across the room, Claire cradled their 5-month-old daughter, Emily, humming softly while swaying back and forth in the rocker. She was still on maternity leave from her job as a preschool teacher, and lately, every day had felt like survival. In the corner, lying near the fireplace, was Max, a retired military German shepherd with a coat graying around the muzzle but eyes still sharp. David had adopted him the previous winter from a local shelter, not fully knowing just how much this dog would come to mean to their family. Max rarely barked, never begged. He simply watched, always alert, always waiting. That night, as snow began to dust the windows and the wind whispered promises of what was to come, the Millers sat close, sharing a modest dinner and stolen moments of warmth. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but deep in their bones they could all feel it coming. Max lifted his head. Something was changing. By midnight, the storm no longer whispered. It roared. The walls of the Miller home groaned beneath the pressure of the wind. Snow slammed against the windows in thick sideways sheets. The power had flickered twice, then died completely. Without electricity, the small home felt even smaller, every creak of wood sounding like a warning. Claire had just laid Emily back into her crib, layering her with blankets, when the sound came. A deep, splitting crack, louder than thunder, sharper than anything she'd ever heard. It was followed by a tremble, then a crash so violent it felt like the sky had fallen. In one horrible instant, the ceiling above the living room gave way. A massive oak tree, one that had stood in their backyard since before they'd moved in, had collapsed onto the house. The front portion of the roof crumbled under the weight, burying the living room in broken beams, shattered glass, and splinters of drywall. David had been standing near the hallway when it happened. The force of the impact threw him backward. His head hit the corner of a table and he slumped to the floor, unconscious. Claire screamed, but the sound caught in her throat as she felt searing pain in her leg. She looked down. A large wooden beam had landed across her shin, pinning her to the floor. Blood soaked through her pajama pants, and every movement sent agony up her spine. Panic surged as she realized she couldn't move, and her baby was in the next room. The thought that Emily might be trapped, hurt, or even worse, filled her chest with a kind of terror she'd never known. Max barked sharply, one loud, urgent sound. He had been lying just feet from David when the collapse occurred. A smaller beam had landed across his hindquarters, trapping his rear leg, but sparing his spine. He yelped, then growled, not in fear, but in frustration. From the nursery, a tiny cry pierced the chaos. At the sound of her baby's cry, Claire's heart lurched. For a fleeting second, a wave of relief washed over her. Emily was alive. That fragile, wavering cry meant her daughter had survived the collapse. But almost instantly, the relief collapsed into raw fear. The cry wasn't strong. It was thin, broken, like a candle flickering against the wind. Claire's throat tightened. Her mind raced with images she couldn't stop. Emily alone, cold, buried, struggling to breathe. She pressed her palms against the floor, trying to will her body to move, to crawl, to do anything. But her legs screamed with pain and she couldn't lift herself. Her relief twisted into helplessness. She was close enough to hear her daughter's voice, but powerless to reach her. And that was its own kind of torment. She screamed, not out loud, but inside, where mothers break when they cannot reach their children. Tears spilled freely down her face, mixing with dust and blood. "Please, God," she whispered, "don't let her be alone." All she could do was lie there, pinned to the ground, listening to her baby cry. And then, through the haze of tears and dust, she saw Max move. Max pulled himself across the shattered floor, dragging his injured leg behind him. Every inch hurt, but he didn't hesitate. He pushed through the broken hallway toward the nursery, led by the faint sound of Emily's cries. The door had come off its hinges during the collapse, but the path was littered with debris. Max crawled over splinters and glass until he reached the crib. Emily lay bundled in a thin blanket, her tiny fists curled, face flushed and damp. Her cries had weakened to soft, rhythmic whimpers. The cold was creeping in fast. Max gently nudged the edge of the blanket with his nose, then used his teeth to pull it free. With great care, he tugged the fabric and dragged it along with the baby across the floor, inch by inch, back toward Claire. Claire gasped when she saw them. Pain racked her body, but instinct took over. She reached out with trembling hands, checking Emily's face first. The baby was cold, her breathing shallow, but she was still with them, still here. Claire's eyes burned with tears. She looked at Max, his side heaving, leg shaking, eyes fixed on her with unspoken urgency. She knew they wouldn't survive the night. David was unconscious, she was pinned, and the storm was getting worse. But Emily had a chance if someone could get her out. Claire pulled off her coat with shaking hands. Every movement was fire through her leg, but she didn't stop. She wrapped Emily tightly in the fabric, then took a long scarf from the floor nearby and looped it under the baby and around Max's torso. "I need you to take her," she whispered, choking on the words. "Please, Max, save her." Max didn't bark. He didn't flinch. He simply stood. The wind hit Max the moment he pushed through the broken front door. Snow whipped through the air like shards of glass, stinging his face and clumping in his fur. The temperature had plummeted. Trees bent under the weight of ice, and the streets of Oak Ridge were buried beneath drifts that reached halfway up the fences. The town was silent, emptied by the storm, asleep under its weight. Emily's tiny form shifted slightly on his back, wrapped tightly in Claire's coat, secured against Max's strong frame. A faint sound, a sigh or a shallow breath, escaped from the bundle. Max paused, turning his head slightly, listening. Still alive, still fighting. At that small movement, something steadied inside him. It was enough. With renewed resolve, he stepped forward into the storm. Each movement was measured, heavy with purpose. His injured leg slowed him down, but Max pressed forward, not aimlessly, but toward a place he hadn't seen in years. The Oak Ridge police station was 3 miles away, and it was the closest place left that might help the child on his back, and the family he had left behind. The streets were unrecognizable, covered in snow and shadow. Power lines sagged, traffic lights blinked uselessly. Max navigated around downed branches, hopped low fences, and weaved through narrow alleyways where the snow wasn't as deep. His body trembled from cold and pain, but he pressed on. Behind him, his paw prints stretched like a trail of silent determination. Each step carved by memory, not chance. Time blurred, wind howled, snow deepened, but Max didn't stop. He just kept going, because she was still breathing, and he wasn't going to let that stop. The Oak Ridge police station was 3 miles away, the closest place Max remembered where help might still exist, for the child on his back and the family he couldn't carry. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the tiled floor. 2 officers behind the front desk looked up from their paperwork, expecting maybe a lost traveler or someone seeking shelter. What they saw instead made both of them freeze. A German shepherd, soaked to the bone, limping on one leg, stood in the middle of the lobby. His eyes were wide, unblinking. Strapped tightly across his back, something wrapped in a thick winter coat. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a muffled sound came from the bundle, a faint, broken whimper. "Oh my God," one of the officers breathed. "Is that a baby?" They rushed forward. Max stood still, body tense but calm. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He waited. One officer carefully untied the scarf and opened the coat. A tiny, pale face peeked through layers of fabric. Her lips were slightly blue. Her hands were curled into fists, unmoving. "She's ice cold," the other officer said, voice tight with panic. "We need medical. Now." The radio crackled to life as they called for immediate emergency response. Another officer grabbed a warm blanket from the supply closet, while someone else ran to grab a heater. As the baby was gently lifted from Max's back, a soft cry escaped her lips. Fragile, strained, but real. "She's breathing," someone said, "but barely." One of the officers knelt down, placing a hand on Max's soaked, trembling shoulder. "You brought her here," he whispered. "You saved her." Max didn't respond. He kept his eyes locked on Emily as the officers worked around her. He had made it through the storm, but the mission wasn't over, not until she was safe. Max didn't rest. Even as the officers wrapped Emily in warm blankets and carried her gently into a back room for emergency care, Max stayed upright. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling from the cold and strain, but his eyes never wavered. One of the officers, a younger man with steady hands, noticed. "He's trying to tell us something." Max took a step toward the door, then another. He turned back briefly, looked at the officer, then toward the door again, and barked, once, sharp, urgent. "He's not done," the officer said. "Someone else is out there." Within minutes, a search and rescue team had been alerted. The storm was still fierce, but now they had a guide. Max limped ahead of them, a flashlight strapped to the harness one of the officers had quickly secured. His pace was slower than before, but his direction was clear. Not once did he hesitate. Through snowbanks, across black ice, past familiar turns and buried fences, Max retraced every step he'd taken. The wind had nearly erased his earlier trail, but he didn't need to see it. He remembered. When they arrived, the sight of the house stopped the team cold. Half the roof was gone. The entryway had collapsed. Fresh debris had piled up around the front. A new section of the wall had caved in, likely sometime after Max had escaped. It looked worse than before, more dangerous, more final. Max barked again, this time more desperate, and charged through the opening he had used to escape earlier. One of the rescuers shouted into the collapsed structure, his voice cutting through wind and snow. "Is anyone inside? Can you hear me?" For a long moment there was only silence. Then, faint and cracking, came a reply. "Here? I'm here." The voice was barely audible, strained and breathless, but it was enough. "That's a live one," a responder yelled. "We've got someone inside." The team moved fast. Using crowbars, saws, and careful hands, they began pulling away debris near the sound. Max stood nearby, watching every movement, his ears alert, his body trembling but still holding. A flashlight beam finally caught her. Claire. She was curled on her side beneath two angled beams, her face pale and streaked with dust and blood. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto the rescuer as he knelt beside her. Her lips moved without sound. Then finally, "Emily, is she—" "You're going to be okay," the rescuer said gently, placing a gloved hand on her shoulder. "We've got your baby. She's safe." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she couldn't speak. Her leg was pinned beneath a thick wooden beam, swollen and turning blue. Every time she tried to shift, pain tore through her body. Nearby, David lay motionless, covered in dust and splinters, but breathing, a pulse. Two paramedics began stabilizing Claire, while others carefully lifted the beam and braced the damaged floor. As they placed David on a stretcher and wrapped Claire in thermal blankets, Max limped to the edge of the wreckage and sat. Snow gathered on his back. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He had brought them here, and now, at last, someone could bring them home. The rescue team didn't waste a second. Claire and David were rushed to Oak Ridge General Hospital in separate ambulances, lights flashing against the storm-dark sky. Max rode quietly in the back of one, too exhausted to stand but unwilling to leave Claire's side. At the hospital, doctors moved fast. David was stabilized. Claire was taken straight into surgery. Hours passed. By the time dawn touched the snowy town in pale gold, Claire stirred beneath sterile sheets. The first thing she noticed was silence and warmth. Her body throbbed in places she couldn't name, but one thought forced its way through the fog. "Emily." She turned her head weakly toward the nurse nearby and whispered, "My baby?" A nurse appeared almost instantly, young and soft-spoken, with kind eyes and a steady presence. "She's safe," the nurse said gently, as if answering the question before it was even fully formed. "Your daughter is here. She's alive." Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks, silent and full. Relief, grief, and love collided all at once in her chest, leaving her breathless. Not long after, they wheeled her, slowly, carefully, down the hallway toward the pediatric wing. Every overhead light felt too bright, every beep too sharp, but none of it mattered. There, behind a glass window, lay a small crib. Emily. A tiny knit hat covered her head. Her chest rose and fell, slow but steady. She was sleeping. Claire pressed her hand to the glass, fingers trembling. "My baby." A quiet sound behind her made her turn. Max. He sat just outside the doorway, still as ever. His eyes didn't leave her. They didn't need to. Claire met his gaze through the glass, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved her." News of what happened traveled fast. By the next afternoon, someone at the hospital had posted a photo of Max lying outside the pediatric wing, eyes fixed on the crib inside. Within hours, the story spread across Oak Ridge. By nightfall, it had reached neighboring towns. People didn't see a tragedy. They saw a miracle wrapped in fur. Donations began pouring in. A local grocery store dropped off boxes of baby formula and diapers. A nearby church sent winter clothes and handmade blankets. Someone quietly paid off part of the Miller's medical bills. An electrician who had seen David's name on the news called the hospital, offering him a job when he was ready. But it wasn't just about money or help. It was about respect. One afternoon, a retired Marine arrived at the hospital with a limp and a cane. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He simply walked up to Max, still camped out near the pediatric room, paused, then gave a slow, silent salute. Max didn't move, but his ears perked and his tail thumped once against the floor. No medals, no speeches, just quiet honor for a mission completed. A week later, the storm had passed. The sky over Oak Ridge was clear, brushed with pink and gold. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the air no longer bit like before. It felt softer, like something had shifted. Claire stepped out of the hospital doors in a thick coat, her leg braced, arms gently cradling Emily. Warm, awake, and finally safe. David walked beside her, slower but steadier with each step. Max followed just behind them, his gait still uneven, but his head high. They paused at the top of the steps. Claire turned to Max, knelt as best she could, and placed a hand on his head. Her voice cracked. "You never gave up on us." Max didn't respond, not with words, but his ears lifted and his tail wagged once. That was enough. Together, they stepped into the morning light, not back to what life had been, but forward, into something new. Something rebuilt, not by comfort, but by loyalty, courage, and the quiet love of a community that refused to let them fall.